In the heart of Mississippi's slave era, two twin sisters were born into bondage. Identical in face, identical in fate, yet bound to a secret so strange that even plantation records refuse to explain it. Their story was whispered, never written. And when questions were finally asked, history went silent. What made these enslaved twin sisters so disturbing that their truth was buried for generations? Why does their mystery still defy explanation today? Before we uncover the bizarre secret history tried to erase, subscribe to the channel for more untold stories they never taught in school. And comment below where you're watching from. Your support helps keep these forgotten voices alive. Now, let's step into Mississippi's most unexplained slave-era mystery. There exists a story hidden in the archives of Mississippi history. A story so strange, so utterly contradictory to everything we believe we know about the American South, that historians have spent generations trying to explain it away. But the harder they've tried to dismiss it, the more questions have emerged. More inconsistencies. More impossible details that simply do not fit into the narrative we've been taught. In the spring of 1847, two identical twin sisters were born on a plantation in the Mississippi Delta. Their names were Harriet and Louisa. They looked identical in every conceivable way. Same features, same height, same voice. But here's where the story becomes genuinely difficult to reconcile with historical reality. One of them was classified as enslaved. The other was not. One lived a life of captivity. The other lived a life of relative freedom within the same household, the same walls, the same land, the same Mississippi heat and humidity that defined their daily existence. No one has ever adequately explained how this was possible. Not the plantation records, not the family documents, not even the few eyewitness accounts that survived. Historical archives contain conflicting information about their parentage, their legal status, and the circumstances that created this impossible situation. Some documents suggest they had the same father. Others claim they had different fathers. Some records indicate their mother was enslaved. Others state she was free. The contradictions are not minor discrepancies. They are fundamental inconsistencies that undermine the basic facts of their existence. What happened to these women? How did they navigate a world where one sister could be property and the other could not? What secrets did their family keep that would necessitate erasing parts of their history from public record? And perhaps most troubling, if such an arrangement existed once, how many other times did it happen? How many other families harbored secrets that defied the very structure of slavery itself? This is not a story that has been told. Not in its entirety. Not with the detail and chronology that the evidence demands, and the reason is simple. The truth about Harriet and Louisa challenges everything we understand about the legal and moral architecture of slavery in America. Their existence suggests that the system was not as absolute, not as unchangeable, and not as universally accepted as the historical narrative would have us believe. We begin our investigation in a time and place where the land itself seemed to reject the foundations upon which wealth and power were built. We begin in Mississippi in the years before the Civil War, when questions about freedom and bondage were becoming impossible for anyone to ignore. To understand what happened to Harriet and Louisa, we must first understand the landscape that contained their lives. The Mississippi Delta is not simply a geographical location. It is a place where contradictions seem to flourish, where wealth accumulated alongside devastating poverty, where some men held absolute power while harboring profound vulnerability, where public declarations of certainty masked private uncertainty. By the 1840s, the Mississippi Delta had become the epicenter of American slavery. The expansion of cotton cultivation had transformed the region into an economic engine that fed the entire American economy. Wealth flowed through Mississippi in ways that made the fortunes of northern merchants and European textile manufacturers. This wealth was built entirely on enslaved labor, on the backs of people who were classified as property rather than people, on a system that was becoming increasingly difficult to justify even to those who benefited from it most. The plantation where Harriet and Louisa were born belonged to a man named Thomas Richardson. Richardson was a man of considerable means, but not of aristocratic background. His wealth had been accumulated within his own lifetime. He was not old Mississippi wealth, he was new Mississippi wealth. The kind of wealth that required constant expansion, constant acquisition, constant proof of success. This distinction matters because men like Thomas Richardson operated under different pressures than the old planter elite. They had something to prove. They had reputations to establish. And they had secrets that could unravel their carefully constructed social positions. The Richardson plantation covered approximately 2,000 acres. On this land lived roughly 300 enslaved people. The plantation was managed with the kind of efficiency that characterized the most profitable agricultural enterprises of the era. Records indicate that Richardson kept meticulous accounts. He tracked every tool, every bushel of cotton, every resource. Yet when it came to Harriet and Louisa, the records become suddenly vague, suddenly incomplete, suddenly contradictory in ways that suggest deliberate alteration. The plantation house itself was a structure of some significance. Built in the Greek Revival style that had become fashionable among wealthy planters, the house commanded views across the cotton fields. It contained more than 20 rooms. It had been expanded twice since its construction in 1832. The expansion coincided intriguingly with Thomas Richardson's marriage and the subsequent births of his children. But there is no record of expansion in 1847, the year Harriet and Louisa were born. No architectural additions, no construction costs recorded in his accounts. And yet, according to later testimonies, something changed about the household structure that year. Space was reorganized. Rooms were reassigned, and the normal hierarchies of the plantation household became strangely disrupted. The Delta in 1847 was a place of particular tension. The Mexican-American War was consuming national attention. Questions about slavery's expansion into new territories were beginning to fracture the political alliances that had previously held stable. Newspapers from Memphis and New Orleans made their way to plantation houses like the Richardsons. And while the formal political debates happened in distant chambers, in places far removed from the Mississippi heat, the implications were becoming impossible to ignore for planters who read between the lines. Thomas Richardson was a man who read carefully. His business correspondence shows someone obsessed with controlling information, with managing narratives, with ensuring that what happened on his plantation remained his to control. This is the man who became the father of Harriet and Louisa. This is the man whose household contained the mystery that has puzzled historians ever since. The spring of 1847 was when everything changed, though no one recognized it at the time. The change came quietly, without announcement, without any formal documentation that would alert neighbors or authorities to what was occurring within the Richardson household. According to the plantation records that survive, a woman named Caroline was living in the quarters, the slave quarters, on the Richardson property. Caroline was described in inventory list as a domestic servant, which indicated she worked within the main house rather than in the fields. She would have had access to different spaces, different information, and different relationships than field hands. This distinction, while seemingly minor, was crucial. Domestic servants occupied an ambiguous position within slavery. They were not field hands, yet they were enslaved. They had more proximity to white family members, yet they were still fundamentally property. They had skills and knowledge, yet they could be sold away at any moment. Caroline occupied this precarious space. In April of 1847, Caroline gave birth to twin daughters. The births occurred over the course of several hours. There were no doctors present. Such births were typically attended by midwives, and the woman who attended Caroline's birth was a woman named Rebecca, herself enslaved, who had attended births on the Richardson plantation for nearly 3 decades. Rebecca's name appears nowhere in the formal records of the plantation. Yet later testimonies given years after the fact indicate that Rebecca was present during these births, and that she held information about what transpired that no one else possessed. What we know about the births comes from fragmented sources. Some information comes from plantation records. Some comes from oral histories passed down through enslaved families. Some comes from official documents filed with the county, and some comes from private letters that were never meant for public consumption. When we piece these sources together, we find ourselves looking at an event that seems to generate different narratives depending on which source we consult. The plantation records indicate that one child, Luasa, was born to Caroline on that April day. She is listed in the inventory simply as a female child of unnamed parentage. The listing is perfunctory. One line among dozens of entries about property and resources. But directly above the entry for Louisa, in the same record, another child is listed. Harriet, also female, also born in April of 1847. And here is where the contradictions emerge. Some versions of the record suggest that both children were born to Caroline. The inventory lists them together as if they were siblings. Yet other documents, later amendments to the original record, indicate that Harriet was born to a different mother. Who was this other mother? The records do not say, the name is obscured, the parentage is unclear, but the legal classifications are very clear. Harriet's classification is different from Louisa's. Harriet is classified as free. Louisa is classified as enslaved. How is this possible? How can two identical twins born on the same plantation, in the same household, be classified with different legal statuses? This question becomes the central mystery of this entire episode. This question is what historians have avoided answering. This question is what the Richardson family records seem designed to obscure. One possibility is that one of the fathers was a white man of sufficient social standing, that his paternity could not be publicly acknowledged but could not be entirely hidden. Another possibility is that the legal classification of one child was deliberately falsified to protect her from slavery. A third possibility is that there was a deliberate arrangement, perhaps a promise made during pregnancy, that one child would be raised as free while the other remained enslaved. The most compelling evidence comes from a single letter discovered decades after the Civil War, written by Thomas Richardson's wife, Margaret. In this letter, written in 1848, Margaret references the births in a manner that suggests surprise and discomfort. She writes of the unexpected duplication and its attendant complications. She writes of decisions that required discretion beyond what might normally be expected of a Christian household. She writes of an arrangement that must remain confidential to preserve the standing of all parties, both those who claim it and those who merit it. What does this mean? Who are all parties? Who claims and who merits? The language is deliberately opaque, but the tone suggests awareness of something that contradicts the normal functioning of slavery, something that required special handling, something that had to remain secret to protect multiple people in multiple ways. As Harriet and Louisa grew, the physical impossibility of their situation became impossible to ignore. They were identical twins. They looked exactly alike. Anyone encountering them would have seen two perfect reflections of the same child. Yet they were to be treated completely differently. One would grow up as enslaved property. The other would grow up as a free child. The plantation records from the 1850s suggest that the household adapted to this situation in ways that seem deliberately calculated. Louisa appears in the household accounts as a hand or servant, which was the standard terminology for enslaved workers. But Harriet appears differently. She is sometimes listed as a visitor, sometimes as a relation of the household. Sometimes she is not listed at all, despite living in the same house. Several testimonies from people who lived on or near the Richardson plantation during this period describe seeing the girls playing together in the woods and fields that surrounded the house. These accounts, recorded decades after the fact by abolitionists and freed people who had knowledge of the plantation, describe something that struck observers as deeply wrong. The two girls were identical. They dressed identically. They played together constantly. Yet one was treated as a human being. One was treated as property. One particularly detailed account comes from a man named Samuel Johnson, who had been enslaved on a neighboring plantation. Johnson's narrative, recorded in 1872, provides specific details about witnessing the twins. He describes seeing them sitting together under a large oak tree. He describes how anyone passing would have assumed they were sisters, which they were, though the implications of that sisterhood were radically different depending on which plantation authority one asked. Johnson writes, "I seen those girls play like children do. They didn't seem to understand yet that one was supposed to be different from the other. The little one called Harriet, she would go wherever she pleased. She went in the main house. She came out. No one told her no. The other one, Louisa, she understood better. By that age, maybe 7 or 8, she understood that things were not the same for her. She would stop and wait. She would look at her sister going somewhere, and she couldn't follow. I seen that. I seen a child understand her own captivity by watching her sister's freedom." This account, while written in dialect that reflects the transcription choices of the recorder, captures something essential about what made the Richardson plantation different during this period. The situation was not hidden from the people living there. The enslaved people on the plantation knew what was happening. They watched two identical children being raised with different expectations, different freedoms, different futures. What did Thomas Richardson intend by this arrangement? What was he trying to accomplish? The available evidence suggests several possibilities, but none of them paint a coherent picture. Perhaps he felt genuine paternity toward both children, and wanted to protect one from the worst aspects of slavery. Perhaps he was attempting some kind of psychological experiment. Perhaps he was demonstrating his power and authority by showing that he could exempt one child from the legal status that bound all the others. The household staff would have had to maintain this distinction on a daily basis. They would have had to treat two identical children differently. They would have had to watch the children understand gradually that their physical sameness did not determine their legal status. They would have had to enforce a kind of psychological violence that went beyond the usual violence of slavery. This was not merely owning enslaved people. This was manipulating the fundamental assumptions that enslaved people had about their condition. During the 1850s, the plantation records become increasingly sparse regarding the twins. Inventories that once listed every enslaved person by age and capability become vague when it comes to Louisa. Harriet's name disappears from official documents entirely. Yet personal correspondence from the household indicates that both girls were present. Both were growing. Both were aware of their situation. Margaret Richardson's letters from this period show increasing anxiety about the arrangement. She mentions the strain of maintaining appearances. She mentions the difficulty of explaining certain decisions to relations who visit. She mentions the impossible position in which we find ourselves regarding the children. She never explicitly names the twins, but the context suggests that their presence in the household was creating ongoing tension. Other plantation owners who visited the Richardson property would have observed the twins, or at least observed something unusual in the household dynamic. Southern society operated according to strict codes of racial classification and visual identification. A person's appearance was supposed to indicate their status. But Harriet and Louisa defied this fundamental assumption. They looked identical, yet they were classified differently. This was not merely unusual. This was destabilizing to the entire visual language through which slavery operated. By the time Harriet and Louisa reached adolescence, the situation had evolved into something far more complicated than the initial arrangement could have anticipated. The girls were no longer small children whose differences might be explained away or whose movements might be easily controlled. They were becoming young women, and their identical appearance was becoming increasingly impossible to ignore. The 1850s were a time of extreme political tension regarding slavery. The Compromise of 1850 had temporarily eased tensions, but everyone understood the compromise was fragile. The question of slavery's expansion into new territories kept resurfacing. Newspapers and magazines carried increasingly heated debates about the institution's future. In a household that had deliberately created an internal contradiction regarding slavery, this external pressure created almost unbearable tension. Multiple sources from this period indicate that Thomas Richardson began isolating the twins in ways that went beyond the normal hierarchies of plantation life. Harriet was sent away periodically to stay with relatives in other parts of Mississippi. These absences are documented in family letters and in Richardson's business correspondence. Why would he send one twin away? The explanations offered in the letters are always vague. Family circumstances require her temporary absence. A change of scenery is deemed advisable. Relations require her presence. Louisa remained on the plantation during these absences. The household accounts indicate that her tasks changed during these periods. She took on different responsibilities. She worked in different spaces. It was as if when Harriet was absent, Louisa could more fully inhabit the role of enslaved domestic servant without the constant visual reminder of who she might have been under different circumstances. Oral histories recorded from formerly enslaved people who had contact with the household during this period suggest that the separation was traumatic for both girls. They had grown up together. They had understood each other in ways that bound them more tightly than the legal distinctions that supposedly defined their relationship. Separating them did not dissolve their connection. It simply forced them to experience their connection in isolation. One testimony, recorded in 1880, describes an incident in which the twins were discovered in the quarters late at night, sitting together and talking. This incident apparently caused considerable upset in the household. The testimony, given by a woman named Ellen who had worked in the main house, indicates that Margaret Richardson discovered the meeting and was furious. "I was there when Mrs. found them," Ellen recalls. "The two of them looking exactly alike, talking like they was sisters, which they were, though one of them weren't supposed to be no relation to nothing. Mrs., she looked at them and she looked sick. Not angry, sick, like she was seeing something she couldn't unsee." The incident appears to have resulted in stricter controls on when and where the twins could be together. Records suggest that Louisa's movements were more closely monitored. Perhaps because she was enslaved and therefore could theoretically be controlled more absolutely. Perhaps because the household was attempting to prevent the kind of sisterly solidarity that challenged the entire logic of the arrangement. But what was the arrangement? By the 1850s, it was no longer a secret exactly. It was more like an open secret. People within the household knew. People in the neighborhood knew. But no one spoke about it. No one named it directly. The visual evidence of two identical girls living under different legal statuses was undeniable. But the social codes that governed plantation life dictated that certain things simply were not discussed in direct language. There are hints in the surviving correspondence that some members of the Richardson family wanted the arrangement to end. Some wanted Louisa's status to be formalized as enslaved, which would theoretically resolve the contradiction. Others apparently wanted Harriet's status to be questioned, which would create different complications. And still others seem to want to maintain the status quo, understanding that any change would force them to acknowledge what they had managed to leave unacknowledged. Thomas Richardson appears to have died in 1856. His death is documented in the family records and in the county records. The plantation changed hands. Management of the property shifted to a man named Robert Ashford, who married into the Richardson family and assumed control of the estate. Ashford's approach to the twins was markedly different from Richardson's. Where Richardson had maintained the ambiguous arrangement, Ashford seemed to want clarity and absolute control. In the years immediately following Thomas Richardson's death, the plantation records were reorganized. This is documented in the handwriting change in the ledgers. The accounts that had been maintained by Richardson himself were now being rewritten by Ashford or someone working under his direction. And during this reorganization, certain records were altered. The most significant alteration concerns Harriet's legal status. In the original plantation records from the 1840s and 1850s, Harriet's classification is ambiguous. But in the rewritten records that Ashford created, Harriet's status changes. She is now listed not as free, but with a different classification entirely. The notation is unclear, but it appears to indicate that she was being reclassified. Scholars who have examined these documents have struggled to interpret what the new classification meant. One possibility is that Ashford was attempting to resolve the contradiction by bringing Harriet's legal status into alignment with Louisa's. If both were enslaved, then the visual evidence of their identical appearance would no longer require explanation. They would simply be two enslaved twins, which was unusual but not impossible. Another possibility is that Ashford was creating a different kind of cover-up, one that made Harriet's status more rather than less obscure. Around the same time, letters began disappearing from the Richardson family correspondence. The letters that survive from the 1840s and 1850s reference letters that no longer exist. Margaret Richardson's letter of 1848, which discusses the unexpected duplication, references another letter to her sister in which she apparently discussed the situation in greater detail. That letter does not survive. Letters from other family members also vanish from the historical record. During this period, oral histories suggest that the twins' movements were severely restricted. Harriet, who had previously been allowed considerable freedom, was increasingly confined to the household. Louisa continued her work as an enslaved domestic servant, but both girls were kept under close watch. Neither was permitted to leave the plantation without explicit permission and supervision. An account recorded in 1868 by a man named Charles Harris, who had worked on the Richardson plantation as a carpenter and builder, provides important detail about this period. Harris describes being called to the plantation to perform modifications to the building. He notes that several rooms were altered or reconfigured. Walls were moved, passages were blocked. He recalls being specifically instructed not to discuss what he observed and being warned that further employment in the county depended on his discretion. They was changing the house around, Harris recalls in his recorded testimony, making it so people couldn't move between certain spaces without going through places where they could be seen. I understood what they was doing, though nobody said it plain. They was making it harder for those girls to move around together. They was separating them not just with rules and with talk, but with walls and doors and passages. I built those walls. I helped them do it. Why would the household require physical architectural changes to maintain the separation of two young women? The question suggests that the separation through rules and oversight had failed. The twins were finding ways to communicate, to see each other, to maintain a connection that contradicted the entire purpose of the legal distinction between them. By 1859, the eve of the Civil War, the plantation records show both Harriet and Louisa listed as enslaved. The ambiguity has been resolved through falsification of documents rather than through any actual change in their circumstances. The legal record now states that they were both always enslaved. The contradictory entries have been altered or removed. The letters that documented the initial arrangement have been destroyed or hidden away, but the change was not merely administrative. Physical confinement had increased. Louisa's work assignments changed again. Instead of serving in the main house, she was assigned to work in a separate building, a cottage that had apparently been constructed for this purpose. The construction is documented in Ashford's building accounts. The cottage is listed as a domestic facility, but no explanation is given for why a second domestic facility would be necessary when the main house already contained extensive servant quarters. What happened to Harriet during this period? The records provide almost no information. Her name simply disappears from documentation. She is not listed in inventories. She is not mentioned in household accounts. She is not assigned tasks or responsibilities. It is as if she had become invisible, present but not recorded, alive but not counted. The Civil War shattered the social structures that had contained the mystery of Harriet and Louisa. As the war progressed and the Confederacy's position deteriorated, the Richardson plantation, like many plantations in Mississippi, fell into disorder and confusion. The system of control that had kept the twins separated became increasingly difficult to maintain. The earliest Union forces to reach the Mississippi Delta came through in 1862. The advancement of Union armies created unprecedented chaos on plantation lands. Enslaved people fled. Some joined Union forces. Some made their way to towns that had come under Union control. The elaborate system of surveillance and control that had characterized plantation slavery began to collapse. In the confusion of 1863, both Harriet and Louisa disappeared from the plantation. There is no documentation of when they left or in what circumstances, but accounts from people who fled the plantation around the same time mention the twins. According to one testimony given in 1864 to Union officials, the two girls left together, walking away from the plantation toward Union lines. This account contradicts the assumption that they would have been separated by Ashford, that they would have been forced to leave at different times or through different routes. But other accounts suggest a different scenario. One testimony indicates that Louisa remained on the plantation for several more years, even after Ashford had fled. According to this account, given much later, Louisa remained because she did not believe she could leave. The enslavement was so complete that even when the plantation dissolved into disorder, she could not imagine herself as free. Harriet, according to this account, did leave, and may have reached Union lines. The confusion and contradictions in the accounts of what happened during and after the Civil War suggest that no one was keeping careful records of the twins during this period. They simply ceased to appear in the documentation that planters and Union officials were generating. They became what many thousands of formerly enslaved people became: persons without official status, without clear documentation, moving through a landscape of extreme upheaval and uncertainty. Researchers tracking the fates of specific enslaved individuals during and after the Civil War have struggled to locate definitive information about Harriet and Louisa. Census records from 1870, taken in the Reconstruction period, contain no entry that can be definitively identified as either twin. There are women of appropriate ages and unclear racial classifications listed in the records from the area, but none are definitively identified as the Richardson twins. The plantation itself was destroyed during the war. Union forces moving through Mississippi in 1864 and 1865 burned many plantation houses as a matter of military policy. The Richardson house was apparently destroyed in 1864, according to accounts from soldiers and from people living in the area. With the destruction of the house came the destruction of many records. The surviving documentation is fragmented. The twins' lives in the post-war period remain almost entirely unknown. What is clear is that the elaborate arrangement that Thomas Richardson had created and that Robert Ashford had attempted to control and obscure could not survive the collapse of slavery itself. The legal distinction that had been so carefully maintained became meaningless once slavery was abolished. The girls' identical physical appearance, which had been such a destabilizing challenge to the visual language of slavery, lost its terrible significance. But what happened to them after the war? What became of two identical young women whose lives had been defined by a legal distinction that no longer existed? Did they find each other after the war ended? Did they find family? Did they build lives that were beyond the reach of those who had once controlled their every movement? In the decades following the Civil War, historians and researchers occasionally stumbled upon references to the Richardson twins in their investigations of plantation slavery. A researcher examining family correspondence might encounter vague references to the complicated matter of the two girls. An archivist organizing plantation records might notice the inconsistencies and alterations. But because the twins were never famous, because no one had written their biography or advocated for their story to be remembered, the mystery remained peripheral to historical scholarship. The rediscovery of the Richardson twins as a historical problem began in the 1960s, when a scholar named Dr. Margaret Hayes was researching the social structures of Mississippi plantation slavery. Hayes encountered the plantation records and immediately recognized the inconsistencies. She noticed the changes in classification. She noticed the missing letters. She noticed the architectural modifications to the house. And she understood that these fragments pointed to something significant that had been deliberately obscured. Hayes spent years attempting to track down information about the twins in post-war records. She examined census records, she searched newspaper archives, she investigated property records, court documents, and military records from the Reconstruction period. She interviewed descendants of people who had lived on or near the Richardson plantation, hoping to find oral histories that might illuminate what had happened. What she discovered was both significant and frustratingly incomplete. She found evidence that both Harriet and Louisa survived the Civil War. She found references in a Freedmen's Bureau document to two young women of uncertain racial status who appeared in a refugee camp in Mississippi in 1864. The description roughly matched the twins' ages and appearance, but the document did not provide names, and the uncertainty about racial classification matches the lifelong ambiguity that had defined their lives. Hayes also discovered a baptism record from a church in Jackson, Mississippi, dated 1875. The record lists two women, sisters, being baptized into the church. The names on the record are different from Harriet and Louisa. They are listed as Harriet and Louise. Slight variations in spelling that might indicate transcription errors or might indicate deliberately altered names. The record provides no information about their origins or backgrounds, but the fact that two sisters were baptized together shortly after the Reconstruction period suggests some continuity in their relationship. Most intriguingly, Hayes discovered evidence that one of the women, identified as Harriet, may have remarried in the 1870s. Court records from Mississippi reference a marriage license issued to a woman with a similar name, though the documentation is incomplete. If this was indeed Harriet, then she went on to build a life beyond the plantation. She married, she may have had children, she may have created a family narrative that included nothing about the plantation, nothing about the impossible circumstances of her birth and childhood, nothing about her identical twin sister. What happened to Louisa is even more unclear. Hayes could find no definitive records after 1875. She did find oral histories, passed down through African American communities in Mississippi, that referenced an enslaved woman who had remained on a destroyed plantation even after the war ended, apparently unable or unwilling to leave. According to some of these accounts, this woman eventually moved north, perhaps to Memphis or even beyond. But these accounts are fragmentary and often come from sources far removed from anyone who actually knew her. Hayes's work, published in 1978, brought renewed attention to the Richardson twins. But even with her extensive research, the gaps remained substantial. The core mystery, how the arrangement came to exist in the first place, what Thomas Richardson intended, who the twins' biological parents actually were, remained unsolved. In subsequent decades, other researchers have attempted to build on Hayes's work. DNA technology has become available, but without any identified descendants willing to participate, or without any preserved biological material from the women themselves, that avenue of investigation has not been pursued. Genealogical research into the Richardson family has revealed that Thomas Richardson did have children with his wife Margaret, legitimate children of unquestioned status. Some of their descendants are alive today, but attempts to get them to discuss the twins have been met with refusal or claims of ignorance. The mystery has persisted because the evidence that would definitively answer the key questions simply no longer exists. The letters that explained the arrangement were destroyed. The plantation records were altered. The women themselves left no known written accounts of their lives. Their voices were not recorded. Their stories were not preserved in any official way. What we are left with are fragments, contradictions, hints, and implications. A record that tells us something extraordinary happened, but refuses to tell us exactly what or exactly why or exactly what it meant for the women whose lives were most directly shaped by these events. Why does the story of Harriet and Louisa matter? Why should we care about two women who disappeared into the disorder of the Civil War and left behind almost no trace of their subsequent lives? The answer lies not in their individual fates, but in what their existence tells us about the system of slavery itself. For generations, historians have presented slavery as a monolithic system, absolute in its control, unchanging in its operation, absolute in the distinction between enslaved and free. The system operated according to law, according to racial classification, according to inherited status. This narrative provides a clear moral division between the enslaved and the enslaver. It suggests that the system was so total that individual acts of defiance or resistance were marginal to its functioning. But the Richardson twins present a challenge to this narrative. They suggest that the system was less absolute than we have assumed. They suggest that at least some enslavers recognized the system's moral contradictions and attempted to address them in private rather than abolishing the system itself. They suggest that the line between enslaved and free was not as absolute as the legal code insisted it should be. What did it mean for one twin to be enslaved and the other to be free? What does it suggest about how slavery actually functioned in practice, as opposed to how it functioned in law and theory? These are questions that historians have not adequately addressed, perhaps because addressing them would require acknowledging that slavery was not a system of absolute certainty, but rather a system built on constant assertions of certainty in the face of deep contradictions. Consider the implications for other plantation households. If the Richardson family could maintain an arrangement where one of two identical children was enslaved and the other was not, then what other arrangements were possible? How many other exceptions to the absolute rules existed? How many other private arrangements contradicted the public laws? The story also raises questions about paternity and sexual violence. The most likely explanation for how one twin could be free while the other was enslaved is that they had different fathers, or that one was claimed to have a different father for legal purposes. This brings into focus the sexual violence that was inherent in slavery. The way that enslaved women were vulnerable to sexual assault by white men, the way that children born from such assault occupied an ambiguous position within the system, the way that white men could either claim or deny paternity depending on the legal and social implications. Thomas Richardson's arrangement may have been his way of claiming paternity for one child while denying it for another. It may have been an attempt to give one child the protection of acknowledged paternity while leaving another to the status her mother held. Or it may have been more complex than that. An attempt to create a legal fiction that allowed him to exercise control over both children while maintaining different relationships with each. Whatever the specific meaning of the arrangement, it points to something crucial about slavery that the system's defenders never wanted to acknowledge. The system was built on contradictions that individuals were constantly trying to manage and control. The law insisted on absolute distinctions, but the reality of human relationships made those absolute distinctions impossible to maintain. The story of Harriet and Louisa also raises questions about the lives of enslaved people themselves. How did the people living on the Richardson plantation understand what was happening with the twins? What did it mean to watch two identical children be treated differently based on a legal distinction that no one could adequately explain? Did it create fissures in the enslaved community's understanding of the system? Did it create moments of doubt or resistance? Samuel Johnson's testimony about seeing Louisa stop and wait while her sister went where she pleased suggests that the twins' experience may have served as a kind of object lesson in slavery's power. By demonstrating that she could exempt one child from the bondage that held all the others, Thomas Richardson was demonstrating the absolute nature of his power. But this demonstration also created a visible contradiction that everyone had to pretend not to see.